Ukraine has fired US-supplied long-range missiles into Russia for the first time. Russia says 6 of the ATACMS missiles were fired into the Berdyansk region, with 5 fully intercepted by air defences. It says one of the missiles fell onto a military facility and ignited a fire. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov denounced the attack and accused the United States of working to escalate the conflict.
The President mentioned this several times. If long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory, it will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we'll react accordingly.
The long-range attacks came as Russian President Vladimir Putin approved an updated nuclear doctrine, which says Moscow could consider using nuclear weapons if it was subject to a conventional missile or long-range drone assault supported by a nuclear power. The Pentagon says the change is more irresponsible rhetoric from the aggressor.
We aren't surprised by Russia's update to its nuclear doctrine. It's something that they've been signaling that they intend to update over the last several weeks. It's the same irresponsible rhetoric that we've seen before and that we've seen, frankly, for the past 2 years. So it's something that we're going to continue to monitor, but we don't have any indications that Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon within Ukraine, and we don't see any, we don't see any changes that need to be made to our own nuclear posture as well.
Our Global Affairs editor John Lyons joins us now. John, can you explain Putin's new doctrine for us?
Well, yes, Gemma, what he has now signed into law in Russia is a new nuclear doctrine, which says that if there is an attack from a non-nuclear state on Russia, if it's backed by a nuclear state, it will be treated as a joint assault on Russia. It's clearly in light of these new events, in light of the fact that Ukraine is now firing long-term missiles, ballistic missiles. The ATACMS are lethal for a couple of reasons. They're long range, about 300 kilometres. They are being fired into Russia, and they, most importantly, strategically, is they can be fired surface to surface. So rather than the shadow missiles that the British and the French have given to Ukraine, these can be fired from a mobile unit, which can hide anywhere. And so the Russians won't know when they see one of these coming in the bushes, they won't know what sort of missile it's got, whether it's got an ATACMS, which goes so fast and is so much more lethal. That's why this is suddenly escalating, because the Russians, this is something they didn't want. The Americans have been living under that threat, though, the whole world has, of, it has more nuclear warheads, Russia, than any other country. So the United States will be ready for this. Hopefully Russia doesn't fire a nuclear weapon. I think that's something everybody wants to avoid. I think, though, I'm sure the Pentagon would have planned this, and I suspect they would have a plan for if he does fire a nuclear weapon, they will have a pretty fierce response, which of course we hope the world doesn't see.
And is this threat against not just Ukraine facilities, but also US facilities?
Yeah, so the Russians are not saying specifically who they would target. I don't think the Russians would target directly the United States. But look, every so often Vladimir Putin has used brought out the nuclear threat. And so it's something that the world has lived with now since this war began 1,000 days ago yesterday. And therefore, the West has to make a judgment. I think the Germans take this more seriously. The word out of Germany is that they do think that Vladimir Putin could be serious. The United States, though, and the UK and others are suggesting that it's basically bluster.
Now, we heard some of the White House's response a moment ago. How are they treating this new doctrine?
Their public line is that this is, yet more bluster from Vladimir Putin. But as I say, I think the Pentagon will be on high alert. They have a major satellite and surveillance system in Poland. They've set up in Warsaw since the war started. And so they can spot any activity. The Russians have sometimes been using... The irony here is that Vladimir Putin's complaining about the Ukrainians firing missiles into Russia. He has been firing missiles into Ukraine for the last 1,000 days, including the Kinzhal missile, which are the most lethal of all. They are to missiles what taipans are to snakes. And so now the United States, every time, they can only be fired from the air by a MiG jet. So every time a MiG jet takes off in Belarus or Russia, the Americans get an alert and tell the Ukrainians, and they're on alert in case there's a missile, a Kinzhal coming in. And the Americans have set up Patriot defence systems inside Ukraine, especially around Kyiv, to try to stop some of these missiles. But look, it's certainly escalating, and I think it's all to do with the Donald Trump factor.
And, I mean, what broadly is happening on the battlefield?
On the battlefield, the Ukrainians are losing slowly. There's no doubt that the Russians are eking away more and more land. They have an advantage in the sense that there's no accountability for their losses. Thousands and thousands of young Russians have died, and Vladimir Putin is not accountable. So he can keep sending more and more cannon fodder. And in fact, it's got so desperate for him now that so many Russians have been killed. He's brought in these 10,000 or so troops from North Korea who are now massed on the border. That's another reason it's escalating, because the United States and Ukraine believe that those North Koreans are ready any time to make a push to try to take Kursk back off the Ukrainians. Kursk, of course, is inside Russia. The Ukrainians have taken that, and the North Koreans have been brought in to try to, as sort of cannon fodder, to go in and try to take that back from the Ukrainians.
Finally, John, in this space between Donald Trump being elected and taking office, how can this influence decisions from Ukraine, from Russia and from the US?
Well, I think it's all about Donald Trump. There's 10 weeks to go. He has said he can solve it in 24 hours. Both sides expect a negotiation. That's why I think the Ukrainians wanted to take Kursk as a bargaining chip. We'll give you back Kursk if you give us Crimea. It's all about trying to postulate and get ready for negotiations. All roads are leading to Donald Trump.